Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 66. I am your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we are excited to have back with us the award-winning artist, historian, cartoonist, and educator, Robert Brunelle Jr. Robert, thank you for joining us again. This is I just checked. I checked the list. You were episode 4 last year, and now
I got in on the ground floor. Yeah,
yep, you're right there, right one of the big heavy hitters I had coming in right at the beginning. So,
where do you find all these other people? That's what I want.
I should have you on every week. We had plenty of things to talk about. And when I reached out to you, I think when we were communicating a couple of months ago, saying, "Hey, let's get back on." And we mentioned there was a lot of topics we didn't get to last year, and we thought maybe it would be a good thing to kind of concentrate this episode and just really hammer home on some of doing a kind of a deep dive on the history of political cartoons. And as a retired teacher that you are, you came prepared and you sent me a lot of images in advance, and we're excited to jump right into it. And before we
be a quiz, so pay attention.
Robert, real quick, in case somebody hasn't really gone through the archives and checked out the issue of episode 4, do you want to give people kind of a brief background on how you got into not to get into the deluge of all your types of art you do, sculptures and fine art and painting and teaching, but where did your passion of the cartooning history come from? And then we can dive in and talk about the political cartoons.
Well, cartoons had a huge influence on my youth. I was less interested in comic books, but I loved newspaper strips. I loved to read the Sunday funnies. And I'm 62, so when I was a kid, back in the 60s, it was the tail end of the golden era of newspaper strips. A lot of the early strips were just reaching the end of their lifespan. So I was lucky enough to see things like Little Orphan Annie and Buzz Sawyer and all those great strips that had their heyday back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, Bringing Up Father and so forth. And then I was there for the transition into the new cartoons like Wizard of Id and Broomhilda and all those. So I just loved that stuff. And I got my start as an artist really by just sitting down and copying cartoon characters and trying to come up with my own. And when I was an art teacher, I realized that drawing cartoons was a tremendous way to introduce every art concept to kids. Perspective, form, composition, color. And cartoons are non-threatening because they can be extremely simple. You don't necessarily have to have tremendous artistic ability to draw a cartoon. Gary Larson. But you can still make tremendous cartoons, so it worked out well.
All right, Gary Larson just commented. He said, "Leave me alone." No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, he can afford to. But yeah. And so it's a non-threatening way to get into art in general.
Right. And so in one of the situations that I remember we were and I remember last year when we were talking about political cartoons in particular, you're mentioning the brevity of life of political cartoons and how that is kind of its own genre altogether when it comes to the Sunday morning funnies. In fact, that you mentioned last year, it's actually in a different part of the newspaper. It's never really in there. So and you itself, and we'll pull up some images later in the show about some of you actually also have a cartoon that's out that is called Mr. Brunell Explains It All, that actually has a lot of not every comic strip is a political cartoon, but I would say well over 50% of it is, and we'll talk about the difference between some of your ones that are more evergreen as compared to your political cartoons on how that is. But take us back when we talked about it last year about how the beginning of cartoon came about. How was political cartooning the first gave birth to cartoons or comic strips, or did political cartoons come after the birth of the comic strip?
No, actually, political cartoons are the oldest form of cartooning.
Okay.
In fact, long before there were comic books or comic strips or anything like that, there were political cartoons. In fact, archaeologists have discovered political cartoons scratched on the walls of ancient Roman ruins.
Really?
Graffiti where people were making fun of the local politicians. And in the Middle Ages, they had broadsides they would paste to the sides of walls complaining about this or that or the other thing. But the political cartoon as we know it today really came into its own in the 18th century, the 1700s, because that's when the newspaper and the magazine came to the fore. So now you have a venue for the political cartoons. Okay. But yeah, political cartoons, people have been complaining about politicians since time immemorial.
Since politicians.
Yeah, it's since politicians. So yeah, I'm sure ancient Greek, when they invented democracy, the next day there was a political cartoonist inscribing something on a pillar somewhere about how much he hated the local guy.
What's up with this guy? Yeah.
So yeah, they've been around forever and ever. And the other thing that's unique about political cartoons is, unlike other genres, political cartoons actually have a real effect on the real world. They change politics, they bring down tyrants, they form public opinion, they influence events, and sometimes they lead to tragedy, as we'll talk about later. So the political cartoon, unlike other cartoonists, political cartoonists actually put their life on the line in some countries. You know, they can be arrested and killed or put in jail for what they do. And
like,
it's been that way
like a few years ago with that Charlie Hebdo. That would have been a good example of that. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and politicians really, they pay close attention to what the editorial cartoonists are saying about them, because they do exert a tremendous influence on the public. Maybe not so much today with the death of the newspaper, but say mid-20th century, 50s and 60s and 70s, you know, if you were Lyndon Johnson or Nixon, you know, you'd pay very close attention to what the editorial cartoonists were saying about you.
Right. So talk to us a bit about, we have some images that we that we've queued up. So as early as the earliest one that you wanted to talk about, would that be, we're looking at maybe James Gilray? Was that the earliest one?
Oh, the early one. Let's look at the Paul Revere one.
Okay. All right.
We've all seen this picture in our high school textbooks, you know, and we think it's an actual factual drawing of what's happening, but it isn't. This is a political cartoon.
Okay.
And it's a pure propaganda. The actual event, what happened was a small group of British soldiers were attacked by a huge mob of colonials who were throwing rocks and snowballs at them and so forth. And they were in fear for their lives. But Paul Revere twists the whole thing around, so it makes it look like these cold-hearted British soldiers are mowing down these poor, helpless colonials.
Oh, wow.
And this print went all over the place, and it's one of the things that led to the Revolutionary War, actually. It so inflamed public passion. So this is an early example of the power of the political cartoon, for good or ill, or for its ability to sway public opinion.
Wow. And that was, and so that was one of the first, as you said, Paul Revere, he's the one that actually produced that in his own newspaper.
Yeah, in fact, he produced several images of it. An interesting note, one of the first casualties of the Revolutionary War was a freed slave, African-American, named Crispus Atticus. And in the first version of that print, Revere puts him in, but the second version of the print, he takes him out.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And he does all kinds of little tricks like that. Notice he has the British all lined up in a row, like they planned to do this, which is not what happened at all. So, yeah.
Okay. And so that's basically, so compared to that as and this is a good example of, as that you said earlier, is how political cartoons can sway public. Because one thing, and I remember I don't want to jump ahead, but I remember one thing that we were talking about last year was about, Boss Tweed as an example of, that famous quote you told us last year. I don't. Did you want to? Are we jumping around, or do we want to go someplace else first?
We'll say, yeah, we'll talk about Boss Tweed in a little bit, but the point here is that a picture really is worth 1,000 words.
Right.
You know, Paul Revere summed up in that one image so many different ideas. If this had been converted into text, you know, it would have been paragraph after paragraph. Nobody would plow through all that. But they'll look at this picture and say, oh my God, you know, the British are killing us. Let's go to war. Which is one of the things a political cartoonist has to do, is to distill a lot of thought into one or two panels, you know, a few panels. You got to get your point across because the average reader is going to look at it for maybe 10 seconds. If you're writing it, if there's dialogue, like in my cartoons, it's all about paring it down, paring it down, paring it down. How can I pack a maximum of thought into a minimum of words?
Right.
I think I said last time we chatted, it's like writing haiku poetry, you know, in a strict form. I spend twice as long writing my cartoons as I do drawing. And no matter how well I proofread it, when I post it, somebody will say, oh, you forgot that, or you misspelled that. I'm the world's worst proofreader. So I apologize ahead of time. I'm not insulted if you post and say, you forgot the word the in the second panel. I don't know why. I just can't see it. Oh, well.
So that next image, did you want to pull up that James Gilroy? Would that be the
let's
next
talk
one?
about that. Yeah.
Okay. So what do we see here? We see this is also a famous one.
This is during the Napoleonic Wars. This came out in 1805. And one of the things I like about the British were the best political cartoonists of the 18th and even 19th century. And they're the most savage caricaturists. Nobody can caricature somebody the way the British do. So on the left here, we see William Pitt, who's the prime minister. And on the right, we see little tiny Napoleon. And they're carving up the world between them using their swords. It's Plum Pudding is the name of this cartoon.
Okay. But
what I love about this cartoon is just the facial expressions, especially on Napoleon. He looks like a maniac. And I love the hats. These incredibly ridiculous hats. So yeah, this painting, this drawing was made almost 200 years ago, actually over 200 years ago. And it's, you know, it's still just as silly and humorous today. So
that's amazing. And so, and this would be an example of a way that how did this change the sway of the general public? What was the purpose of that one to be?
Well, they were trying to drum up support for the anti-Napoleon, Napoleonic Wars. They were trying to point out that Napoleon's this madman who wants all of Europe to himself. William Pitt only gets a little bit of the British Isles, and Napoleon takes half the world. So yeah, it's the government trying to drum up support for the war, basically.
Okay, right, yeah. One of our previous guests, Stephanie, just said this is fascinating. So yeah, thank you, Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm glad you liked it.
And next, did you want to? So we looked at James. We looked at kind of like the early 18th, the 19th century.
Let's talk about Daumier. He's my favorite. Let's put up the pears.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Honoré Daumier is one of my favorite artists. When I first encountered him in college, one of the things I loved about him was he was a premier painter, but he was also a tremendous cartoonist. So this gave me courage that I could do both. I could be a painter and a cartoonist at the same time. And he was always getting into trouble with the king. This is the king, Louis Philippe. And this is actually a response to a previous cartoon he had drawn in which he showed the king's face looking like a pear. And the king was so mad about that, rather than apologize, Daumier doubles down and makes a cartoon in which he shows step by step how he turned the king into a pear. And this cartoon also is historically significant because it's one of the first examples of a 4-panel cartoon.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And The king was so mad about this that he threatened to throw Daumier into jail. So if we go to the next Daumier one, Gargantua.
Okay. Oh, right here. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, this is 1831. He really doubles down. This is the king sitting on a toilet.
Oh, geez.
And
yeah.
these people are bringing sacks of gold up for him to eat. Meanwhile, he's excreting documents that make people into aristocrats. I forget what they call them in French. So the point, of course, is that if you bribe the king enough, he'll make you a nobility. This so enraged the king that he actually had Daumier thrown in jail in 1832 for 6 months.
Oh, geez. and so
you think today's cartoons get away with, a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think a modern cartoonist could draw a picture of a politician sitting on a toilet.
There was a lot. Yeah. Like the actual, explicit incitement that, historically speaking, that political cartoons would do was fascinating. Did you want to talk about the third Daumier picture?
Let's talk about that one.
Okay.
Now, this one's extremely tragic. This is called the Massacre by Henri, 1834. What happened was there were some protesters in the streets of Paris protesting the latest policies, and the police brutally put down the protest to the point where the police actually went into people's homes and killed them. Wow. So this is the family, a man, his wife, and you look under the man, you'll see a small child. Yeah. And the grandfather over on the side. This police had just come in. So this is horrific police brutality. This cartoon so enraged the police that they confiscated every print they could find, and they confiscated the lithographic stone that it was made on. Wow. And a year later, they used it to justify shutting down freedom of the press in France. Wow. So, but this is a perfect example of what a political cartoon is supposed to do, which is speak truth to power. Right. Call people out when they do bad things, sort of be the consciousness of the state. Hmm.
And do you see? So this is a good example of like we've seen a lot of excitement over in 2020 about freedom of the press and police brutality and things that might be happening. This is not new, basically.
No. Most of the issues we are grappling with today have been with us for a long, long time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
If you want to talk about the Lincoln one next.
Okay. And that one I have is this one right here. Yeah.
Yes. We think of Lincoln as being a hero today, but in his own day, he was reviled by a lot of people. And the cartoonists of the day really had fun making fun of him. What's odd about this cartoon, actually, is it was made by a British cartoonist, John Tenniel, who later went on to fame as the illustrator of the Alice in Wonderland books.
Oh, okay.
But he did this for Punch. It's called Abe Lincoln's Last Card. And what it refers to is the Emancipation Proclamation, which a lot of people felt was Lincoln's desperate attempt to win the war. It's sort of like his last resort. Mm. But if we study this image, there's a lot of fascinating things. One thing, notice that Lincoln's hair looks like devil horns.
Right.
And Lincoln is drawn kind of paunchy, like he's not really ready for war. And look at the expression on his face. And the card that he's holding is a black spade, which is a not too subtle reference to African-American slaves. Yeah. And it's from this cartoon that we get the phrase playing the race card.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. And what's the significance of who is he playing against? And the
he's playing against a Confederate soldier.
Okay.
Because you see, the rest of the world didn't necessarily see the Confederates as the bad guys.
Really?
Yeah. They didn't really have a preference. They thought it was fascinating this war was happening, but some countries backed the Confederacy and some countries backed the Union. But mostly it was for monetary reasons. They didn't really have a moral stake in abolishing slavery or anything like that. Countries that were dependent on the cotton that came from the South backed the South. And countries that traded a lot with the Union factories backed the Union. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, what's the significance of the gunpowder?
Well, that the explosive situation, the war itself was about to happen. Notice that the Confederate officer looks fairly well dressed and put together, where Lincoln looks kind of disheveled there, especially the way his boots are splayed out and everything.
Right.
I love the expression on Lincoln's face too. He looks furious.
So how long after then? I'm kind of curious though. It's like how long post Civil War did Lincoln have a favorable view on in history then?
Well, him being assassinated actually turned public opinion and made him into sort of a martyr.
Wow. Okay.
So his funeral lasted 20 days, and the whole procession on the train where he went through all these towns so people could see him, and then being laid out in the Capitol and so forth. So that's when the Lincoln as the saint idea started to gain momentum. But it really wasn't until the early years of the 20th century when the last of the Civil War veterans began to die off, and,
right.
The memory of the war began to fade from living memory, that people began to make him into the icon he is now. They didn't put him on the money until the 1930s, I don't think.
Okay, wow, and I remember it's like my grandfather, when he was talking about when he came back out of World War II, and he would be a part of the procession of Independence Day parades, and he still remembered seeing Civil War veterans. Part of the parade, they had this Civil War, and then you had, and it kind of went all up through, and then it was when he remembered when he was marching, he was. He first was the last ones, but then, with the Korean War soldiers, he said it was amazing. It's like just historically, not only did you see like the difference in uniforms, but just like difference in height. Like it was, he found that fascinating too.
I once had a jacket worn by a Union soldier, and it was tiny. It was very disintegrated, so I couldn't save it, but I saved the buttons and the lapel, but it was from a Vermont regiment.
Yeah.
And they were quite small.
Yeah.
Compared to if you go to Fort Ticonderoga and look at the uniforms worn by the Revolutionary War soldiers, they look like they were children.
Wow.
I mean, they're extremely tiny compared to modern. That's what nutrition does for you.
Yeah. Once they started pasteurizing cheese, everything just went out of the window.
Well,
yeah.
Washington was 6 feet tall, and everyone thought he was a giant. And so Lincoln was taller than that. He was, I forgot, like 6'4" or something like that.
Right.
There was another famous cartoon. I don't have an example of it, but the cartoonist draws Lincoln as this really tall, slender figure. And the joke is, long Abe a little longer, about his reelection.
So next, do we have, would it be Grover Cleveland is what we want to look at next? Okay. Here we go.
Grover Cleveland, poor guy. He fathered a child out of wedlock, and that's what this cartoon refers to. And it threatened to disrupt his campaign. You see a little tag coming off his coat, says Grover the Good. And the baby said, "I want my pa." And there was a poem that circulated at the time saying, "Ma, ma, where's pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So there's nothing new about presidential indiscretions either.
No, I think that's been, yeah. It's just it's fascinating, Robert, to see to see that we're, as you said, nothing. It's basically this past 4 years or whatever. We've actually just taken all of the excitement of the past 200 years in political cartooning and put it into
We condensed it into a little tiny ball.
to a TikTok video. Yeah, it's like. And so the next one we have the next one up here is would it be what's the Robert Minor? Is that the next one?
No, the Boss Tweed one, if you want to get into that.
Oh,
Twas him.
Yes, this was amazing. I actually ended up watching, and because of your recommendation last year, after our interview last year on episode 4, you talked about this. You talked about Boss Tweed and how this kind of changed everything, that the political cartoon did, and I found it so I really enjoyed learning more about Boss Tweed and what he did and how and what and I think I'll let you do the quote that you said last year but I'm cutting you off, so I'll let you talk about this.
That's all right.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
This is by Thomas Nast, who was one of the greatest cartoonists of the 19th century, probably one of the greatest ones in American history. This was made in 1876. Nast invented a lot of the visual vocabulary that cartoonists still use today. For instance, he invented the Republican elephant. And he didn't invent, but he popularized the Democratic donkey, which had gone back to the 1840s. He also invented our modern idea of what Uncle Sam looks like, the tall guy with the beard and the hat. And he invented the money bag symbol, for money, and a whole bunch of other things. He's probably best remembered today for his attacks on Boss Tweed, who's that fat guy on the left hand holding the hat in his hand. He's got a big diamond stick pin. He's got a beard.
Yeah.
And Boss Tweed ran Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic political machine of New York City. And he was notoriously corrupt. The fellow with the glasses on the right is the mayor of New York City at the time. And they're all pointing to each other in a circle. It was him. He was the corrupt one. And they're going all around in the circle. Nast attacked Tweed mercilessly for his corruption and so forth. And Tweed famously said, "I don't care what they write about me because my constituents can't read, but those damn pictures are going to get me." And he was right. Nast made it so hot for him that he had to abscond to South America. He thought he was safe, but a South American recognized him from Thomas Nast cartoons. And that led to him being extradited back to America, where he eventually fell from power. So, yeah. Go ahead.
I want to ask you, this is kind of like the theme through all this. I'm really curious. We see the pictures and we see the subject, but there are the cartoonists behind it. And is it mandatory for a political cartoonist to be political, or can you just be observational, I guess?
Well, every political cartoonist has a point of view.
Right.
Some hide their point of view better than others. I myself try to be relatively neutral. I go after both sides if they do something stupid.
Right.
It just so happens that in recent years, some people have done more stupid things than others. I can't help that. But also, something we haven't talked about, but when we get into, when we talk about Winsor McCay, in the olden days, political cartoonists didn't have the freedom they do today because the editors told them what to do.
Oh, okay.
Or the publishers. And in fact, we can skip right in. Let's talk about because it segues nicely into my Winsor McCay one, the war.
Okay. Yeah. This one?
Yeah. Winsor McCay was one of the great cartoonists. He created Little Nemo in Slumberland. He was a pioneer in animation. He did Gertie the Dinosaur and so forth. In those days, the newspapers in America were owned by two gigantic syndicates. One was the Hearst Empire, William Randolph Hearst, and the other was the Pulitzer, Joseph Pulitzer.
Okay.
Between them, they pretty much owned every newspaper in America. And Hearst, McCay worked for Hearst, and Hearst didn't like the fact that McCay had this side gig of doing animation and everything. So in his later years of his career, Hearst forced McCay to do political cartoons, even though the content of those cartoons didn't necessarily reflect McCay's worldview. They reflected William Randolph Hearst's worldview.
Oh, okay.
And this cartoon, it's an anti-war cartoon from the First World War era, 1917. It's quite poignant, and like everything McKay did, it's beautifully drawn.
Right.
But Hearst didn't want America to get involved in the war, and so this is sort of an anti-war cartoon. There's some really tragic images that McKay drew, anti-immigration cartoons, where we see Uncle Sam shoveling the immigrants onto a steamship.
Right.
You know, brutal by modern standards, but that's what Hearst wanted, and McKay had to go along with the program.
Right.
But okay, getting back to your other question, can the cartoonists have a point of view? Yes, they do. In modern times, it's the cartoonist's point of view more than the editor's point of view. But it becomes self-selecting. If you're a left-wing cartoonist, your stuff's going to appear in left-wing publications more than it's going to appear in right-wing publications, and vice versa. So cartoonists tend to gravitate towards the venue that's most accepting of their point of view.
And do you find that, as we mentioned, you know, with so many polarizing ways that people can access their confirmation bias, basically, do you feel that because of this, political cartooning isn't as influential as it was, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Probably it's becoming more in little info bubbles.
Right.
I think just like in the old days, where there was 3 networks giving you the news and everybody watched the same news.
Yeah.
So somebody like Walter Cronkite could sway public opinion across the country.
Right.
Those days are gone. And I think the same is going to be true for editorial cartoons. So like you said, if you are a left-winger, you're only going to see left-wing cartoons. And if you're a right-winger, you're only going to see right-wing cartoons. So there's less chance nowadays, I think, of cartoonists changing anybody's mind. And that's kind of sad, really. But
right, because you're creating your own echo chamber, because the people that want to watch it, I
think we're falling into that same trap that everyone else is, and I don't know a way around that. I myself try to remain neutral, and I try to keep them funny enough so that even if you don't agree with me, you might get a chuckle out of it. Maybe this will make you think a little bit about what I'm trying to say.
Right. Would one strategy be if you're an editorial or political cartoonist would maybe infiltrate mainstream things with insinuations and mainstream cartooning, maybe, or that take away from the point of making political cartoons?
Some cartoonists are able to straddle the line between political commentary and entertainment, like Doonesbury,
right?
Gary Trudeau. Some of his cartoons are very political, others are not. Some are just wry commentaries about modern trends and things that are going on in the world. Some of them are very much, anti the president or whatever.
Right.
Which means sometimes newspaper editors don't know what to do with them. They'll put them in with the newspaper comic strips, or they'll put them on the editorial page. And some will refuse to print him at all because they don't like what he said.
Right.
So, yeah. But I don't know.
So what's the Robert Minor picture?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay.
This is one of my personal favorites. This is called At Last, the Perfect Soldier. And Robert Minor was a left-wing socialist. In fact, he was an outspoken member of the American Communist Party. Okay. He drew this in 1917 for a left-wing magazine called The Masses. And it really annoyed the government because they were trying to drum up support for the war. And here he is, pointing out how awful war is and implying that you were stupid if you signed up to be a soldier. So this cartoon led to the closing down of the magazine, The Masses.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
But
okay.
it was highly influential, and it's been reproduced many times. As a matter of fact, during World War II, it was resurrected by other left-wing publications.
Okay.
but it's a great cartoon. This big hulking brute with no head.
I recognize Miner's work. Didn't he do stuff in the New Yorker as well during that time?
No, New Yorker came out in 25, so he may have, but I don't think so. But you've probably seen variations of that cartoon because, as I said, it was reproduced many times and with slight variations for years and years.
All right, and so will that bring us up towards we're looking at now in the Dr. Seuss. That would be the next one coming up.
Let's
right?
look at Dr. Seuss.
Okay.
Before he became a beloved children's author, he was a political cartoonist.
Okay.
And this dates from 1941. And the target of his cartoon here was the isolationists in America who didn't want America to get involved in World War II. And so he was pointing out that, Hitler's a real threat here and we need to do something about it.
Right.
So what's interesting is he already had that kind of cute style. So there's kind of a disconnect between his drawing style and the seriousness of his message. Excuse me, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
But he did a whole series of these. In fact, he did several parroting Mussolini and Hitler and so forth. And there's a book that just came out recently called Dr. Seuss Goes to War. That has compilation of all these.
Okay. And so this one seems to be pretty self-evident what he's saying here is like basically it was, which is interesting. Compare that to Miner's, where Miner was anti-war, saying don't go to war, where this one is saying we need to go to war. So
there you go. See, so here's they very definitely had different points of view here.
Right. And one was from World War, as you say, that they reproduced that Miner one during World War II. So you had two versions of a political cartoon saying we need to do something, and the other one says we need to mind our own business. So,
yeah.
Huh, okay. And would that take us to now Herb Block, the 1949?
Yeah, let's look at that one.
Okay.
Herbert Block, who went by the pen name Herb Block, was the greatest of the mid-20th century political cartoons. He was probably one of the last of the really influential political cartoons who really could change public opinion. This one was made in 1949. It's called Fire. And we see the guy's hysterical guy running up the ladder about to put out the torch of liberty. This was a commentary on the Red Scare, the Cold War paranoia about communists taking over the country. And later on, we'll see an Oliphant cartoon that speaks to this cartoon because the problem is still with us. It's about people who are only too willing to put out civil liberties in exchange for security.
Right. And does that go through also, we're talking about Herb Block, similar to this one then too?
This is one where this single cartoon was pretty much spelled the end for Joseph McCarthy. This was during the McCarthyism era, 1954. And McCarthy, as you know, was going after supposed Reds in the government and the movie industry and so on and so forth. And it turned out a lot of his so-called evidence was completely fabricated. So that's what this cartoon's about. Where McCarthy really got into trouble is when he went after the army and he tried to show that there were higher-ups who were communists. And of course, the army was having none of that.
Right.
So this cartoon really brought down Joseph McCarthy. So this cartoon's a beautiful example of how a political cartoon can influence real-world events.
And so McCarthy, he was a senator, right? And he was
Tail Gunner Joe, Joseph McCarthy. He was from Wisconsin, I believe. Mm-hmm. And he, after World War II, during World War II, Stalin was our ally. But shortly thereafter, Winston Churchill created the Cold War because Winston Churchill was worried that if America and communist Russia became allies, that would spell the end of the British Empire and British domination of the world and European hegemony. So he did his famous Iron Curtain speech. Churchill invented the term Iron Curtain. And he said, there's an Iron Curtain descending across Europe and blah, blah, blah. And so this created hysteria about the communists taking over the world, and that led to the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And so how long did McCarthyism then basically last? That was post World War.
It started after World War II,
okay,
and it went up into the mid 50s. And see what happened. The backstory here: during the Depression, a lot of American intellectuals did become communists. They saw what was happening in the Russian Revolution and so forth under Lenin, and they thought that was a good alternative to what was happening in America with the fall of capitalism. So a lot of writers and artists and Hollywood people did flirt, at least, with joining the Communist Party. But years later, after the war, they forgot about all that. You know, patriotism. Let's go to war. We got to defeat Hitler and fascism. But in the 50s, this came back to haunt them.
Okay.
A lot because McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover began digging into the files of these people and said, yes, you were a member of the Communist Party. And so McCarthy kind of built his whole political career with the help of Roy Cohn and a young guy named Richard Nixon. They built their whole career on routing out the commies. People like Lucille Ball, for instance, they went after her. They went after a lot of people in Hollywood, Dalton Trumbo, the endless list. In the beginning, some of it was legitimate. There were a few communists lurking in the shadows, but he couldn't stop. He just kept going and going, and he got more and more desperate as he became more and more famous. And this all also dovetailed nicely with the rise of television. Because he did these hearings on TV, which was a novelty. So, and then of course we have the Korean War, which was all about fighting the commies, happening in 52, 51.
Right.
So it all came together in this noxious stew of paranoia.
Wow.
But America went through a Red Scare in the 20s too.
And this basically, as you said, this political cartoons helped put an end to McCarthyism.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. It's amazing to think about how much influence and responsibility cartoonists have. When you're able to, especially as you mentioned earlier, it wasn't up to the edit at this point in time in the 50s. Was it still up to the editor to determine that, or did the political cartoonist be able to do that?
In Winsor McCay's day, the editor actually told the cartoonist what to draw.
Right.
By Herbert Block's day, he was pretty free, but he still had to pass editorial muster.
Right.
He had to submit it, and the editor would say yay or nay.
And did they? Was there so? In the 40s and the 50s, when you actually had maybe one town newspaper or one regional newspaper, did the editor have to acknowledge separate political point of views? Would there be or would their editorial section have something that was going one way and another one going the other way, or was it basically reflective of what the editor's own personal politics were?
Well, yeah, it wasn't so much the editors as the publishers.
Okay.
Guy on top. Pretty much just like the Murdochs rule Fox News.
Right.
And the entire Fox News empire reflects Rupert Murdoch's point of view.
Yeah.
Well, that's the way it was in those days. William Randolph Hearst and his successors had a certain point of view, and Pulitzer had a certain point of view. And so that filtered down, the chief wants this to happen, Now, in the days of syndication came along, where instead of working directly for the chain of newspapers, your work was syndicated by independent syndicators like King Features or something. What would happen then is if you're the editor of the small town newspaper, you'd look through the catalog of the syndicate of what was available. and you'd pick and choose the things that you thought your readers would like looking at.
Right.
So if you lived in a conservative area, you would only choose material that would appeal to conservatives, and vice versa.
Because it was good business. It was a good business to run a newspaper.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So the one of the more recent ones we have up here. Did you want to talk about the Pat Oliphant one?
Yeah. All right. This is Pat Oliphant is sort of the successor of Herb Block.
Okay.
In this cartoon, I chose it because it's very much like Herb Block's one of Fire, about the guy putting out the Statue of Liberty.
Mm-hmm.
This was published right after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And this little tiny kid says civil liberties. And the title is Watch Out for the Backswing Kid. This was when the Patriot Act was coming out, and there was controversy about government surveillance, but everyone was all panicky because of the attacks. You know, how much civil liberty are you willing to give up in order to be secure? And that's what this cartoon warns about, that, you know, sure, we want to be defended, but at the same time, we don't want to give up our civil liberties, our freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And one of my favorite quotes is by Oliphant. He said, if I couldn't be a cartoonist, I would have been an assassin. So there was a fellow who really did have a definite point of view.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about, we got 10 minutes left on the hour. So let's talk a bit about some of your work. So you have here as an example of Mr. Brunelle Explains It All. So people, if they're interested in seeing this, they can go to your website, but you also have them on
Humor
on
Times.
the web as well. The Humor Times. Okay.
Yes, if you go to www.humortimes and look for the menu of political cartoons and look for Mr. Brunelle Explains It All, you'll see about 400 of my cartoons.
Wow.
Dating back. Well, I've been doing this strip for almost 23 years, so there's a huge backlog of strips, which is interesting. One of the things I mentioned is historians love political cartoons, even though political cartoons have a short shelf life.
Right.
Because they're attached to current events. So when the current event's not in the news, the political cartoon becomes irrelevant. But then it kind of goes into limbo, but then it's dug up again decades later by historians. If you want to really research a particular era, one of the great ways to do it is to look at the political cartoons of the era, because you can really get a feel for what's going on.
Right.
So this cartoon is sort of my homage to Thomas Nast, because, as you know, I collect vintage ephemera, and I happen to own a copy of Harper's Weekly that has the very first Thomas Nast elephant in it.
Oh, wow.
And so here's Mr. Elephant. My character, Mr. Elephant, I think of him as sort of like William F. Buckley, highly educated, elitist, upper crust, who is kind of disgusted by the coarseness of modern Republicans, but he kind of holds his nose and, goes along with it because he craves the power. So here he's introducing Mr. Woolly Mammoth, who's going to take his place, even more conservative than he is. And Mr. Woolly Mammoth says, anyone who isn't a rich white Christian male should leave the room right now. And there's a sort of a visual quote here. Mr. Woolly Mammoth in my cartoon is taken directly from Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland.
Okay.
He drew a woolly mammoth in one of his cartoons, and I thought it was cute, so I borrowed the head of the woolly mammoth and put it in here. But only a real cartoonist historian would notice that.
There's almost an allusion to Boss Tweed in that.
Well, yeah.
Too.
In the first panel, I'm holding up the actual cartoon drawn by Thomas Nast of the first Republican elephant.
Right. And so we also have too, is like, just as an example of some of your work that you have here. And
I remember the relationship between political cartooning and caricatures.
Mm-hmm.
To be a political cartoonist, you have to be good at caricaturing people so that the reader recognizes who you're talking about.
Okay.
So anytime someone comes on the news that's going to be important, I have to sit down and figure out how to draw them. And so here's some of my more recent ones. I think you recognize who these people are.
Right.
The boring white guys, middle-aged white guys, are the hardest to draw. There's no distinguishing features. But
and so for just from a cartoonist perspective, what do you do for so from a cartoonist perspective, what do you do? And I remember we talked about this offline once. I just wanted for the general public to know, it's like you actually have all these images pre-drawn, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but you have like the body's pre-drawn and the arms separate on a different layer, and then you're able to move them, right?
Well, what I do is, first of all, I have the cartoon blanks ready to go with the panels divided up and the logo and everything.
Yeah.
And then, yes, I have, when somebody important comes along, I have to add him or her to my cast of characters. So I draw the caricature of them, but I draw them without mouths and without eyebrows or eyes. Mm-hmm. And I draw them without arms. So I just have like the blank.
Okay.
And so I plug that in. So when I'm going to do a cartoon, like I just posted one today about Pepe Le Pew talking to Trump, actually. And so if you haven't seen that, go to my Facebook page. So I plug them in, and then I figure out who's talking first and who's going to deliver the punchline in the last panel. So it's usually the character on the right of the last panel that delivers the gag. So I got to figure all that out. Then I do the writing. And then after I've figured out the writing, then I add the expressions and the hand gestures to go with whatever it is they're saying. So that's my process. So it's all done digitally. So because you have to work fast when you're a political cartoonist, to jump on the news cycle. You can't take weeks and weeks to come up with a cartoon.
So and because of that, I mean, it's how long in like one sitting? Just you've been doing it for 20 years.
An hour,
start to finish. An hour. You can make a cart. And do you have to? I'm just also curious too. Is like, do you have a notebook next to you or something? Like when he's like, "This is going to be great. I got to write this down because
I do. I watch the news every night, and one of the downside, there's an upside and a downside to being a political cartoonist. The upside is you never run out of material. I'll never have writer's block. There's always more to talk about than you can get to. The downside is you have to watch the news every day.
And that's where the gray hair comes from.
Yes. Yeah, you have to follow it on the news, on the internet. And so you got to keep your finger on what the heck's going on all the time, no matter how depressing it may be.
Yeah.
And so very often I'll have a notepad next to me. I usually watch the news while I'm eating supper. And I'll have a notepad. So, let's talk about this. Or if I see something like the Pepe Le Pew being canceled controversy, or the Dr. Seuss thing, whatever's the hot topic of the day, I figure, what can I say about this that no one else has said?
Yeah.
Because don't forget, there's thousands of cartoonists out there. And you'll see very often cartoonists will come up with the same idea because there's only just so many ways.
Right.
I have more of an advantage. The single panel guys who have to do it in just a single panel, I don't know how they do it. I allow myself 4 to 6 panels to expand an idea.
Right.
So my characters do a lot of talking. And so sometimes I can squeeze 2 gags into the same cartoon. So the top 2 panels, there's the sub gag, and then the bottom 2 panels is the big gag.
Right.
So there's gags within gags. But that's why it takes longer to write them than it does to draw them. Once I've got the writing down pat, then I look at the character and say, what should the character be doing while they're saying this? What kind of gestures? Are they shaking their fist or making a point? Or what are their eyes doing? Right. And so forth. And when I draw myself, Mr. Brunelle, it's a challenge because I have no mouth or eyes. So I have to do everything through the eyebrows or the hands, to get the point across.
And so, from a self-editorial perspective, do you have to change? Your looks. You've been doing it for 20 years. Or you look the same. You look the same the whole 20 years.
No, actually, if you look at my book, my 20th anniversary book, I have a page where I show the evolution of Mr. Brunell.
Okay.
In the early panels, in the early years, I had a ponytail.
Really?
Yeah, and I had pure black hair, but I've allowed myself to get grayer over time. Another interesting thing from the historical point of view, like Facebook, so you posted this 10 years ago, and they'll bring up a cartoon that I posted 10 years ago, and I look at, that's still apropos today. Things do come back.
Right.
And very often I'll bring up a cartoon that I did 9, 10, or even 20 years ago that speaks to something that's going on right now.
Right. Yeah. So so did you want to you had a couple of things you want to show us?
Quick promo.
Yeah.
No, you're not jobs. After the Capitol attack on January 6th, I did a series of cartoons called Know Your Nut Jobs, where it's sort of like a field guide to all the extremist groups and how to tell them apart. And those cartoons, by golly, went viral.
Yeah.
The first one I posted was shared 2,000 times.
Wow.
Which means it could have seen upwards of 2 million people,
Right.
So there was such a demand for it, I created this book. And you can get this at lulu.com.
Okay.
Just look for Know Your Nut Jobs.
Okay.
The other thing I want to promote, Joseph Citro, my friend, wrote this, the Vermont Ghost Guide. Mm-hmm. And I illustrated 148 drawings of ghosts and monsters that you can find in Vermont by town. Every town has a ghost. And the final plug, I have a solo art show at the Emile Gruppe Gallery.
Okay.
In here in Jericho. It goes up on the 21st and comes down the end of April. Several brand new paintings. Because of the pandemic, we're not going to have a opening, but I will be there on weekends in April doing painting demos. So stop by and say hi. But
cool. Right. Well, thank you very much.
My shot, so I'm safe, but you better wear a mask.
That's right. Yeah, Stephanie said that she loves this, and yeah. So Stephanie, I didn't get to post. I missed your other comments. So there, by the time I noticed the comments you're making, we're already past the topic. So sorry. And so thank you very much, Robert. This has been great, and we probably still have more to talk about. So we'll make sure we'll have you come back on. You'll be just a regular guest. We'll have we'll make sure we always have at least one Robert show every once in a while. So
they're a lot of fun. I love to do it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
No,
I don't think so. No.
Oh, okay. All right.
Sorry about that.
No. We're live now, so we're people are milling in the auditorium right now, Robert.
Oh no. It's just like when I was a teacher, the kids coming into the classroom, and inevitably they'd come from two different teachers, so half the class would be there and the other half wouldn't be there. I couldn't start till the other half got there, but I had to keep the first half amused so they wouldn't tear the place apart. So.
It was a balance, huh?
Yeah, I said, just sit quietly till the other half gets here.